The boardroom smelled of leather and old money, the kind that didn't need to announce itself. Garrett Ashford checked his reflection in the polished mahogany table before the presentation began, adjusting his tie, the navy one Marlowe had ironed 3 nights before she signed the papers. He didn't think about her hands smoothing the fabric while he slept. Didn't think about how she'd folded it carefully, placed it on the dresser beside his cufflinks. Men like Garrett had learned early to compartmentalize regret into a drawer he rarely opened. The screen at the front of the room flickered to life. Bennett Global Holdings. The logo pulsed, once clean and corporate, revealing nothing about the empire beneath it. Garrett leaned forward, eager. This partnership announcement would change everything. 2 months of pitching, of perfecting his vision for the Riverside development, of positioning himself as the architect of urban renewal. The committee had been impressed. He could feel it in their questions, the way they'd pressed for details about his long-term strategy, his understanding of mixed-income housing dynamics, his commitment to sustainable design. 47 people filled the conference hall. Investors, journalists, city officials. Garrett had dressed for cameras for the moment when they'd call him to the stage as Bennett Global's newest strategic partner. He'd rehearsed his surprised smile, the humble nod, the firm handshake. Celeste sat 3 rows behind him, her diamond engagement ring catching the overhead lights. Her father's hedge fund had backed Garrett's $5 million deposit. Everything was falling into place. The moderator stepped to the podium. An older man, silver-haired, with the kind of face that had witnessed decades of corporate theater. His voice carried the practiced neutrality of someone accustomed to delivering news that would make or break careers. We gather today to witness a new chapter in Bennett Global's legacy. For the first time since Theodore Bennett's passing, we will meet the visionary who will lead this company forward. Garrett's pulse quickened. This was bigger than he'd anticipated. Not just a partnership announcement, a changing of the guard. Whoever took the reins of Bennett Global would control $3 billion in real estate holdings, technology investments, infrastructure projects spanning 12 states. The Riverside development was just the beginning. If Garrett played this correctly, if he aligned himself with the new leadership early, he could ride their momentum all the way to the top. His phone buzzed against his thigh. He ignored it. Probably another congratulatory text from one of his former colleagues at Sterling & Finch, the firm that had kept him at junior associate level for 3 years despite his obvious talent. Let them watch him ascend. Let them see what happened when you bet on vision instead of seniority. The screen behind the moderator dissolved into a new image. An email thread. Garrett's stomach dropped before his conscious mind registered why. The timestamp read 18 months earlier. November 7th. He remembered that night. Marlowe had made spaghetti, the cheap kind, from the box butter instead of olive oil because they couldn't afford anything else. She'd been excited about something, talking while he scrolled through property listings on his laptop, half listening. Something about an idea she'd had while refilling coffee for a customer who worked in urban planning. The email filled the screen now, impossible to miss. Marlowe's words in plain text, no fancy formatting, the kind of message you send when you're hoping someone will listen to the idea rather than judge the presentation. What if we combined affordable housing with green technology? Not luxury condos pretending to care about sustainability, but actual community-driven development. Solar panels, shared green spaces, units for teachers and nurses and service workers. Make it profitable by scaling the model, not by pricing people out. Beneath it, Garrett's response, sent 4 minutes later while Marlowe washed dishes in their kitchen sink. Stick to serving coffee, babe. Leave the big ideas to professionals. The conference hall had gone quiet. Garrett felt 47 pairs of eyes shift toward him, then back to the screen. His collar tightened. This had to be a mistake, some kind of technical error. Bennett Global wouldn't humiliate a potential partner like this. They were a professional organization, not a tabloid. But the screen continued. 5 more emails appeared spread across the following year, each one from Marlowe, each one containing fragments of the Riverside proposal he'd presented to Bennett Global 2 weeks ago. The community garden concept, the income-tiered pricing structure, the partnership with local trade schools for construction training. Every innovation he'd claimed as his own, time-stamped and preserved, sent to an email address he'd stopped checking once the divorce was finalized. The moderator's voice cut through Garrett's rising panic. Before we meet our new CEO, it's important to understand the values that will guide Bennett Global forward. Integrity, recognition of contributions, the courage to give credit where it belongs. Garrett's phone buzzed again, then again. Text messages flooding in, not congratulations but questions. Screenshots of the presentation already circulating on professional networks. His reputation atomizing in real time. Celeste's chair scraped against the floor behind him. He didn't turn around. Couldn't bear to see her face, the calculation happening behind those perfectly made-up eyes. Her father had leveraged significant capital on Garrett's credibility. If that credibility evaporated, so would the engagement ring, the penthouse apartment in her name that he'd been living in, the carefully curated life he'd spent 2 years building. The moderator stepped aside. The lights dimmed slightly, a single spotlight illuminating the stage entrance. Ladies and gentlemen, I present the founder and CEO of Bennett Global Holdings, Ms. Marlo Bennett. Garrett's hands went numb. She walked onto the stage like she'd been doing it her entire life. No hesitation, no visible nervousness. The woman who used to apologize for taking up space in their shared apartment now commanded a room full of people who collectively controlled hundreds of millions in capital. Her hair was different, shorter styled, with the kind of precision that cost more than their monthly rent used to be. The blazer she wore probably cost what she used to make in 3 months at the Griddle Diner. But her eyes were the same. Dark, intelligent, the eyes that used to watch him across their kitchen table while he complained about his boss, his stalled career, the unfairness of a world that didn't recognize his potential. She'd listened to all of it. Absorbed his frustration, his ambition, his certainty that he deserved more. And apparently she'd been building something while he blamed the world for his mediocrity. Marlo didn't look at Garrett. Not yet. She faced the audience with the composure of someone who'd spent the last 3 months preparing for this exact moment. My grandfather, Theodore Bennett, believed that true leadership reveals itself not in moments of comfort, but in how we handle betrayal. How we respond when our contributions are dismissed, how we choose to move forward when the people we trust treat our value as disposable. Her voice carried no anger. That was somehow worse than shouting would have been. Garrett had spent their entire marriage reading her silences as submission. Now he understood they'd been something else entirely. Assessment. Strategy. The quiet work of someone planning an exit so thorough he'd never see her coming. 3 months ago, I signed divorce papers in a diner where I'd worked double shifts to keep our household running. My ex-husband chose that location deliberately. Public humiliation as a final gesture, making sure I understood my place in his narrative of success. He kept our car, kept our savings, all $2,300 of it, kept the narrative that his career struggles were somehow my fault for not understanding his vision. The screen behind her changed again. Security camera footage from the Griddle Diner. Grainy but clear enough. Garrett standing beside the booth, Celeste at his side while Marlo sat with the divorce papers spread before her. No sound but the body language told the story. Garrett's posture, chest puffed, chin raised. Celeste's hand on his arm, possessive. Marlo's stillness, the pen in her hand signing without reading, because what would be the point of reading? Garrett remembered feeling powerful in that moment, remembered the satisfaction of watching her capitulate without a fight, proof that he'd been right to move on to someone who understood ambition, who came from money, and knew how winners operated. He'd walked out of that diner feeling like he'd shed dead weight. What he didn't know, what he couldn't have known, because he'd stopped paying attention to me years before the divorce, was that 48 hours earlier I'd received a phone call from Victor Sterling, my grandfather's attorney. The man who'd introduced the presentation stepped forward again, and Garrett recognized him now. Not a moderator. The Sterling from Sterling and Hayes, the most expensive estate law firm in the state. The kind of lawyer you called when you needed to move billions without headlines. Theodore Bennett had been tracking my life since I was 13 years old. After my mother's death, he'd wanted to reach out to repair the damage his pride had caused when he disowned her for marrying my father. But Theodore Bennett didn't believe in handouts. He believed in tests, in proving worth. Marlo's gaze finally found Garrett. 3 rows back, frozen in his seat, the expensive suit he'd bought on credit suddenly feeling like a costume. So he waited. Watched me work 3 jobs to put myself through community college. Watched me teach myself coding in the hours between shifts. Watched me stay with a man who treated my ideas as background noise, who spent money we didn't have to impress people, who didn't care, who made me feel small enough to fit into his vision of what a supportive wife should be. The screen shifted to documents, legal filings. Theodore Bennett's will dated 8 months before his death. The relevant passage highlighted in yellow. My entire estate, including all holdings of Bennett Global, shall pass to my granddaughter Marlo Ann Bennett on the condition that she demonstrates the strength to recognize her own value, independent of those who would diminish it. This inheritance shall be revealed only after she has legally severed ties with any individual who has shown consistent disregard for her contributions and character. Garrett's chest constricted. The timeline assembled itself with brutal clarity. Theodore dies. Victor contacts Marlo. 2 days later, Garrett serves divorce papers, thinking he's calling the shots, liberating himself from obligation. And all the while, Marlo had been sitting on $1.3 billion, watching him perform his liberation, letting him feel powerful right up until the moment she pulled the floor out from under him. But inheritance alone doesn't make a leader. My grandfather's final test was, this: prove you can build something without the money. Prove the ideas are yours, not purchased. Prove you understand the difference between wealth and worth. New documents appeared. Corporate filings for Bennett Global's subsidiary investments. Shell companies with forgettable names. Riverside Development Partners, LLC, established 3 years earlier. Primary asset: 35% ownership of the land. Garrett's proposal claimed to have secured through his professional network. Bennett Global owned that land before Garrett ever heard of the Riverside project, before he ever pitched his vision to the investment committee, the committee that was actually Marlo using voice modulation software on video calls, evaluating whether the man who'd dismissed her ideas for years would claim them as his own when given the chance. He had. Every innovation Garrett presented as his strategic genius, every detail of the Riverside proposal existed in emails Marlo sent him over 18 months. The community garden he'd called impractical when she suggested it. The income-tiered pricing he'd laughed at as naive. The trade school partnership he'd dismissed as charity rather than business. She'd handed him a map and he'd redrawn it in his own pen and called himself an explorer. The moderator, Victor Sterling, produced a document sealed in plastic. Partnership agreement between Bennett Global and Garrett Ashford, signed 2 weeks earlier. Garrett's signature in blue ink, confident loops, the signature of a man who thought he'd finally broken through. Clause 12.3 is particularly relevant. The highlighted section appeared on screen magnified so everyone could read. If partner is found to have misrepresented the origins of intellectual property proposals or strategic concepts presented to Bennett Global, this agreement is void immediately. All deposits are forfeited. All associated partnerships, including third-party investments made on behalf of partner, become non-recoverable. $5 million. Garrett had deposited $5 million 3 days ago. Celeste's father's money, plus every cent Garrett could borrow against his future earnings, his car, his reputation. The deposit was structured as non-refundable to demonstrate commitment, to prove he was serious about scaling the Riverside model across multiple cities. Marlo's expression didn't change. No satisfaction, no cruelty. Just the calm certainty of someone who'd done the math and knew exactly how the variables would resolve. Mr. Ashford submitted a proposal claiming 100% original vision. Our preliminary review identified inconsistencies. A thorough audit revealed the source material emails sent by his ex-wife over 18 months each one, documented, time-stamped, preserved on our servers when Mr. Ashford deleted them from his personal account. Garrett's phone had stopped buzzing. The silence felt worse. He pulled it from his pocket anyway, saw the screen filled with messages. Celeste's father's lawyer. Urgent. Call immediately. 3 colleagues from Sterling and Finch, the firm that had kept him at junior level. We need to talk about the Riverside project. His landlord, no Celeste's landlord because the penthouse lease was in her name. Notice of immediate termination of guest privileges. Celeste herself hadn't texted, didn't need to. Garrett heard her heels on the conference hall floor walking toward the exit, each click a small detonation. Other footsteps followed. Investors, he realized. People who'd tentatively aligned themselves with Garrett's pitch, who'd expressed interest in adjacent projects. They were leaving because association with intellectual property fraud was a stain that wouldn't wash out, and money had excellent survival instincts. Marlowe spoke again, and the room stilled. Bennett Global takes intellectual property seriously, not just as legal protection, but as a moral imperative. Ideas have sources. Innovations have authors. Success built on uncredited contributions isn't success, it's theft dressed in a good suit. Garrett stood. Didn't plan to, but his legs moved anyway, propelling him toward the aisle. He needed air, needed to think, needed to find a lawyer who could explain how Clause 12.3 might have loopholes, ways to argue that ideas shared between spouses were communal property, that emails sent during a marriage didn't constitute formal intellectual property claims. But Victor Sterling was already there, blocking the aisle with the patient immovability of someone who'd anticipated every move. He held a manila envelope. "Ms. Bennett asked me to give you this." Garrett took it. Inside, a single check. $10,000. Signed by Marlowe and Bennett in handwriting, he recognized the careful loops she'd practiced at their kitchen table while he watched ESPN, the script she'd developed while filling out job applications and rental forms, and the endless paperwork of being broke. The check came with a note typed impersonal. "This should cover approximately 3 months of modest living expenses if budgeted carefully. You once told me I needed to learn the value of $1. Consider this an education." Garrett's hands shook. The check felt like a grenade with the pin pulled. $10,000. He'd given her nothing in the divorce. Kept the car they'd bought together, kept the savings she'd contributed to every month, even when it meant skipping meals. And now she was handing him exactly enough to survive while he rebuilt from zero the same position she'd been in 3 months ago when he walked out of that diner. Poetic justice, people would call it. Karma. A narrative so clean it would be shared across business schools as a cautionary tale. But standing in that conference hall with 47 witnesses and a $10,000 check that might as well have been 30 pieces of silver, Garrett understood it was simpler than poetry. Marlowe had given him every chance. Every email had been an invitation to collaborate, to recognize her as a partner instead of an accessory. Every idea shared over cheap spaghetti dinners had been a test he'd failed by not listening. And when he'd finally definitively proven he would take credit for her work the moment opportunity allowed, she'd let him. Encouraged him even. Let him pitch his stolen vision to the company she secretly owned. Let him sign contracts designed to trap exactly the kind of man he'd become. She hadn't destroyed him. He'd destroyed himself. She just made sure there were cameras running. Garrett walked out of the Bennett Global Conference Hall with a check in his pocket and nothing else. His phone buzzed once more. Celeste's father. Not the lawyer this time. The man himself. $5 million, Garrett. My $5 million leveraged on your credibility. You have 72 hours to explain how you're going to make me whole, or my attorneys will explain it for you. The lobby doors closed behind him. Outside, Chicago wind cut through his suit jacket. The expensive one he'd bought for today charged to a credit card that was probably already frozen. Garrett stood on the sidewalk and watched people flow past, none of them looking at him, all of them moving with purpose toward destinations they'd planned for and earned. His car was gone, repossessed probably. The penthouse keys wouldn't work anymore. Celeste would have changed the locks by now or had building security revoke his access. She was efficient like that. It was one of the things he'd admired about her back when he thought efficiency and ambition were the same thing. The Griddle Diner was 4 blocks west. Garrett started walking not toward it but past it because he couldn't stomach the symmetry of ending where this began. His phone rang. Sterling and Finch. He let it go to voicemail. They'd be calling to inform him that using stolen IP and professional proposals violated his non-compete clause, that his employment was terminated effective immediately, that he should consider himself fortunate they weren't pursuing criminal charges. By the time he reached the L station, his phone had 12 new voicemails. He didn't listen to any of them. sat on the platform bench and stared at the check Marlowe had given him. $10,000. 3 months if he was careful. If he found the cheapest apartment in the worst neighborhood. If he stopped eating lunch. If he accepted that this was his life now starting over at 32 with nothing but a check written by the woman he'd called dead weight. The train arrived. Garrett didn't board. Sat watching it leave, then the next one, then the next. Eventually a transit cop approached, asked if he was okay. Garrett said yes, automatic the lie people tell when the truth is too complicated for strangers. Are you sure you've been sitting here for 2 hours? Had he? The sky had changed color. Rush hour crowds had thickened, then thinned. Garrett's legs were numb from the cold bench. Just thinking. The cop moved on. Garrett stayed, pulled out his phone and opened his email, the account he'd stopped checking after the divorce. Scrolled back 18 months. Found Marlowe's messages, the ones the screen had displayed to 47 witnesses. Read them properly for the first time. She hadn't just sent ideas. She'd sent questions. What do you think about this approach? Does this make sense from a financial perspective? I know you understand development better than I do. Could we talk through the numbers together? Every message was an invitation. Every idea shared with the assumption that they were partners, that his expertise mattered, that collaboration would make both of them stronger. And every single one Garrett had dismissed or ignored or responded to with the kind of condescending encouragement you'd give a child playing architect with blocks. His phone died. Battery drained from 2 hours of sitting in the cold, checking notifications. He couldn't answer messages from people he couldn't face. The screen went dark and Garrett saw his reflection in the black glass. Suit wrinkled now, tie crooked, hair disarranged from gripping it while he tried to think his way out of a situation that had no exit. He looked exactly like the kind of man who'd lose everything because he was too arrogant to recognize when someone was handing him a fortune, asking only to be seen as an equal. The third train came. This time Garrett boarded. Rode it to the end of the line, then transferred to a bus that took him further from downtown into neighborhoods where buildings were shorter and the streetlights worked intermittently. He got off at a stop he didn't recognize, started walking until he found a motel that rented by the week. The clerk didn't care who he was, didn't recognize him from any business networks or professional conferences. Took his credit card, the personal one not maxed out yet, and handed over a key to room 17. Second floor ice machine, broken Wi-Fi password written on a sticky note. Garrett climbed the stairs, unlocked the door. The room smelled like cigarettes and industrial cleaner. One bed, one desk, one window overlooking a parking lot where half the cars had expired temporary tags. He sat on the bed. It creaked, pulled the check from his pocket and stared at Marlowe's signature. She could have destroyed him completely, could have pressed criminal charges for IP theft, could have leveraged Bennett Global's legal team to ensure he never worked in development again. Instead, she'd given him exactly what he'd given her, nothing but a chance to survive if he was smart enough to take it. Garrett's hands were steady now. The shock had metabolized into something colder. Acceptance, maybe, or just exhaustion. He folded the check carefully and placed it in his wallet behind the expired gym membership card and the coffee shop loyalty punch card that would never be filled. Tomorrow he'd cash it. Find a studio apartment. Start looking for work that didn't require references from people who now considered him professionally toxic. But tonight, in a motel room that cost $49 a night, Garrett Ashford sat with the wreckage of his ambition and understood that Marlowe Bennett had given him the rarest gift, a mirror honest enough to show him what he'd become. 3 months ago she'd signed divorce papers without reading them because there was nothing left to negotiate. Tonight he'd deposit a check she'd written for the same reason. Not because she forgave him, not because she still cared, but because after everything she was still the kind of person who believed in second chances, even for men who'd never given her one. The room's heater rattled to life. Garrett lay back on the bed without removing his shoes, stared at the ceiling where water damage had created abstract patterns in the plaster. Somewhere across the city, Marlowe was probably in a penthouse office reviewing contracts, planning the next phase of Bennett Global's expansion, building the future she'd envisioned while he told her to stick to serving coffee. And here in room 17 of a motel that smelled like failure and cigarette smoke, Garrett finally understood what he'd lost. Not the money, not the career, but the partnership with someone who'd seen potential in him long after he stopped seeing it in himself. Someone who'd offered collaboration and accepted crumbs. Someone who'd waited for him to recognize her value until the day she decided to recognize it herself, with or without his blessing. His phone, dead and useless, sat on the nightstand beside a Bible he wouldn't read and a notepad branded with the motel's logo. Outside, traffic hummed. Inside, Garrett closed his eyes and tried to remember the last time he'd thanked Marlo for anything, the last time he'd asked about her day, the last time he'd treated her ideas as worth the breath it took to speak them. The memories wouldn't come, or maybe they'd never existed in the first place. 2 months felt like 2 years when every day started with the same ritual. Garrett woke at 5:30 in the construction trailer that doubled as site office for the Riverside project, made instant coffee with water from the cooler, and reviewed the day's schedule before the crew arrived at 6. The job title was Site Supervisor, which sounded more impressive than it was. Mostly he checked deliveries against invoices, mediated disputes between subcontractors, and made sure nobody cut corners that would fail inspection. The irony wasn't lost on him. Bennett Global had bought the Riverside land, cleaned the legal complications he'd never bothered researching, and was now building the exact development he'd pitched as his vision. Except they'd hired him not as partner or architect, but as the guy who made sure concrete was poured on schedule. The pay was $48,000 a year. Before taxes. Before the garnishment order from Celeste's father's attorneys who'd gotten a judge to agree that Garrett owed restitution for the investment loss, $2,000 monthly, until the debt was satisfied, which at current rates would take approximately 7 years. His apartment was in Bridgeport, 3rd floor walk-up, 400 square feet, including the bathroom you couldn't fully turn around in. The radiator clanked all night during winter. The couple downstairs fought in Spanish he didn't understand, but recognized the rhythms of accusation, defense, apology, silence. Sometimes Garrett lay awake listening and wondered if he and Marlo had sounded like that to their neighbors back when they'd had neighbors who might have cared. The Riverside site sprawled across 8 acres where textile mills had operated until the 80s. Bennett Global's remediation team had spent 4 months removing contaminated soil, replacing infrastructure, creating the foundation for something that would last. The architecture firm they'd hired specialized in sustainable mixed-income housing. Every detail Marlo had described in those emails was manifesting in steel and concrete: the community gardens, the solar arrays, the ground floor spaces reserved for essential worker housing. Garrett walked the site each morning before the crew arrived, watched the building rise floor by floor, unit by unit, saw families touring the model apartments on weekends, teachers and nurses and transit workers who'd been priced out of neighborhoods closer to downtown. They looked at the gardens with wonder, asked questions about the solar credits, calculated whether they could finally afford something that felt like home. He never told them the development was built on ideas his ex-wife had shared over spaghetti dinners while he half listened and scrolled through real estate listings for properties they'd never afford. The foreman was a woman named Sandra Oakes, 52, who'd been working construction since before Garrett was born. She didn't talk much, didn't tolerate laziness, and had a way of knowing when someone was hiding incompetence behind excuses. First week, she'd asked Garrett directly, "You actually know anything about construction, or is this a resume, inflation situation?" He'd admitted the truth. Mostly planning and proposals. "I can read blueprints. Know enough code to be dangerous." Sandra had nodded. "Long as you don't pretend otherwise, we'll get along fine." Man who knows what he doesn't know is halfway to useful. That became Garrett's education, asking questions instead of faking expertise. Admitting when he didn't understand soil compaction ratios or HVAC load calculations. Learning that the people who actually built things cared less about vision than about whether the measurements were precise and the materials were quality, and whether you respected their time enough to come prepared. 3 months into the job, Sandra pulled him aside after a concrete pour went wrong. Subcontractor had mixed the batch incorrectly, resulted in a foundation section that wouldn't pass inspection. The concrete company wanted to argue, claim their mix was fine, that the testing equipment was faulty. "What do you want to do?" Sandra's expression gave nothing away. Garrett looked at the failed section. Looked at the subcontractor's rep, a guy named Paulson who'd been giving attitude since day one, treating Garrett like he was pretending at authority he hadn't earned. Tear it out. Redo it properly. Paulson's face went red. You know how much that costs? You know the delay that causes less than the cost of the whole building failing inspection because we tried to hide substandard work. Sandra smiled barely. First smart thing you've said all week. They tore out the concrete. Paulson's company ate the cost. Garrett spent the next 2 days double-checking every other batch they'd poured, making sure nothing else was compromised. Found 3 more sections that were borderline. Flagged them for Sandra's review. She brought in an independent inspector who confirmed Garrett's concerns. You developing an eye? Sandra handed Garrett the inspection report. Keep that up, maybe you'll actually be good at this. It was the closest thing to praise Garrett had received in 4 months. He filed the report, carefully added it to the documentation Bennett Global required for every phase of construction. Somewhere in a downtown office, someone reviewed these reports. Maybe Marlowe herself, though Garrett doubted she spent time on operational details. More likely some project manager who'd never heard of Garrett Ashford, who saw him as just another line item in the staffing budget. That should have been depressing. Instead, it felt like relief. Nobody here cared about his failures. They cared whether the work got done properly, whether the building would stand, whether the families moving in next spring would have homes that didn't leak or crack or fail when the first storm hit. Garrett started carrying a notebook, filled it with observations, questions, things he needed to research, how load-bearing walls interacted with open floor plans, why certain materials worked better in cold climates. The actual math behind energy efficiency, not just the marketing language he'd used in proposals. Sandra noticed, started assigning him more complex tasks, reviewing subcontractor bids for accuracy, coordinating between trades when schedules overlapped, dealing with city inspectors who showed up unannounced and needed documentation Garrett had to dig through filing cabinets to find. One afternoon, an inspector named Kowalski arrived asking about the fire suppression system. The drawings showed one configuration, but what was actually installed looked different. Garrett spent 2 hours tracking down the change order, finding the engineering justification, proving that the AS-built system exceeded code requirements, even though it deviated from the original plan. Kowalski reviewed the documentation, signed off on the inspection. Before leaving, he pulled Garrett aside. Most supervisors would have tried to bullshit me. Tell me the drawings were right and what I was seeing was wrong. You did the work instead, just trying not to screw up. Keep that attitude. Most people in this industry, they get comfortable lying. Start small, little shortcuts, little exaggerations. Then one day they're signing off on work they know is bad because admitting the truth means admitting they stopped paying attention years ago. Garrett thought about Riverside proposals with Marlowe's ideas copied verbatim. Thought about pitch meetings where he'd presented concepts he barely understood, relying on confidence to carry him through questions he couldn't actually answer. How do you come back from that? From realizing you've been that person? Kowalski shrugged. Same way you come back from anything. Stop doing it. Do better tomorrow. Eventually, the tomorrow count adds up to something that looks like integrity. The inspector left. Garrett stood in the partially completed lobby surrounded by construction debris and the smell of fresh drywall compound and felt something shift. Not redemption. He wasn't naive enough to think 4 months of honest work erased years of taking credit he hadn't earned. But maybe the beginning of understanding what Marlowe had tried to tell him in 100 different ways. That competence wasn't performance. That value came from contribution, not from convincing people you were valuable. His phone buzzed. Text from an unknown number. Garrett almost deleted it, assumed it was spam or another attorney finding creative ways to garnish his wages. But the preview text stopped him. Your mother gave me this number. Hope that's okay. It's Marlowe. Garrett sat down on a stack of drywall sheets, heedless of the dust. Stared at the message for 30 seconds before opening the full thread. I'm reaching out because Bennett Global is launching a scholarship program. The Theodore Bennett Second Chance Initiative. It's for people rebuilding their careers after significant professional setbacks. Application is blind. No names, just work history and a statement about what you've learned. Victor Sterling suggested I let you know about it. There was a link. Application deadline in 3 weeks. Scholarship covered tuition and living expenses for a 2-year program in construction management at a community college that partnered with major developers for internships. Garrett read the message twice, then a third time looking for hidden meanings for traps. Found none. Just information delivered neutrally the way you'd notify someone about a job posting they might qualify for. He typed a response. Deleted it. Tried again. Deleted that too. What did you say to your ex-wife who'd caught you stealing her ideas, who'd destroyed your career in front of 47 witnesses, who was now offering you a scholarship funded by money she'd inherited? Thank you felt insufficient. I'm sorry. Felt like too little too late. Everything else felt like explaining, justifying, asking for something he had no right to request. Finally, Garrett typed 4 words. I appreciate you telling me. Sent it before he could reconsider. Marlowe responded 30 seconds later. The program isn't about forgiveness. It's about whether people can recognize their mistakes clearly enough to avoid repeating them. Theodore believed anyone could rebuild if they were willing to start from true zero. Not zero with excuses, not zero with blame, just zero. Garrett stared at that message until his phone screen dimmed. True zero. He thought about the motel room he'd lived in for 2 weeks before finding the Bridgeport apartment. Thought about cashing Marlowe's $10,000 check in 5 installments, because depositing it all at once felt like admitting defeat. Thought about Sandra asking him questions he didn't know how to answer and choosing honesty over performance. Was that zero? Or was he still carrying the weight of who he'd been, the habits and assumptions and arrogance that had gotten him here? The application link sat in his messages glowing. Garrett clicked it, read through the requirements. 500 words on professional failure and what it taught you. Transcript from any previous education. 3 references from people who'd supervised your work in the last 6 months. Sandra would be 1 reference. Kowalski maybe if inspectors were allowed to vouch for contractors. The third would be harder. Garrett's professional network had evaporated the day Bennett Global displayed his emails on that conference room screen. People who'd returned his calls before now sent messages to voicemail emails to spam folders. He spent the evening in his apartment drafting the essay. Threw away the first version for sounding too much like a job interview answer, polished and insincere. Threw away the second for wallowing in self-pity. The third version started with a sentence that felt true. I believed competence was something you performed rather than earned, and that belief cost me everything worth having. From there, the words came easier. Not easy, but honest. Garrett wrote about pitching ideas he didn't understand, about taking credit for contributions he'd dismissed, about the specific moment in the Bennett Global Conference Hall when he'd realized the depth of his self-deception. Watching emails he'd deleted resurface as evidence of his fundamental disrespect for the person who'd tried hardest to help him succeed. He wrote about Sandra teaching him to ask questions, about Kowalski explaining that integrity was built in daily choices to do work properly even when shortcuts were available, about standing in the Riverside lobby watching families tour apartments that existed because someone had cared enough about the idea to see it through properly with or without credit. The essay ran 800 words. Garrett cut it to 500, then 450, then back up to exactly 500. Sent it to his personal email so he could read it on his phone during his lunch break the next day. Sitting in the construction trailer with a sandwich from the corner bodega, Garrett read his own words and felt the strange vertigo of recognizing himself and not liking what he saw, but not looking away either. Sandra knocked on the trailer door. You good? Your face looks like you're getting audit notices. Just reviewing something. She glanced at his phone. Whatever it is, it's making you miserable. Take a walk. Concrete crew won't be here for another hour anyway. Garrett pocketed the phone. Walked the perimeter of the site, checking progress against the schedule posted in the trailer. They were 2 days ahead, unusual for construction projects. The crew had started taking pride in the work and building something that would house actual people instead of just generating profit for investors they'd never meet. One of the framers, a guy named Deshawn, who'd been in the trade for 15 years, waved Garrett over to look at a window installation. This is wrong. Manufacturer sent the wrong size. Garrett checked the specs. Deshawn was right, half-inch variants that would cause problems with the weatherproofing. Good catch. I'll call the supplier. Already did. They're trying to say it's within tolerance. I'm saying tolerance doesn't mean anything if water gets in the wall. What do you need from me? Email from someone with authority. They'll listen to the white guy in the collared shirt before they listen to the black guy in the tool belt. Garrett drafted the email on his phone. Made it clear the windows needed replacement, that Bennett Global's contract specified exact measurements, that tolerance was a manufacturing guideline, not an excuse for substandard materials. Copied Sandra and the Bennett Global project manager, whose name appeared on all the official correspondence. The supplier responded within an hour. New windows would arrive by end of week, no charge for the replacement. Deshawn read the email over Garrett's shoulder. Appreciate that. Some supervisors, they'd have told me to make it work, not worth the hassle to fight the supplier. It's your name on the framing. If it fails, you're the one who gets blamed. Least I can do is make sure you have proper materials. Deshawn nodded. Went back to work. Sandra appeared beside Garrett, silent as a ghost for someone who wore steel-toed boots. You're learning. Most college boys who take this job, they think construction is just bossing people around. You're figuring out it's about removing obstacles so skilled people can do their work properly. I'm mostly just trying not to screw up worse than I already have. That's the beginning of wisdom. Knowing how much you don't know. She walked away before Garrett could respond. He watched her coordinate with the electrical crew, pointing out potential conflicts between conduit runs and structural beams, solving problems before they became expensive mistakes. This was competence, not vision or strategy or the ability to sell ideas in conference rooms. Just the accumulated knowledge of how things worked and what happened when you cut corners and which details mattered even when nobody was watching. Garrett submitted the scholarship application on a Sunday night, sitting on his apartment floor because the desk chair had broken and he hadn't bothered replacing it. Uploaded his community college transcript from a decade ago, back when he'd been taking business classes and dreaming about corner offices. Entered Sandra's email for the reference along with Kowalski's, and after considerable internal debate, his former supervisor from Sterling and Finch, who probably wouldn't respond but deserved the courtesy of being asked. The application confirmation arrived immediately. Automated message thanking him for his interest, noting that selections would be announced in 6 weeks. Garrett closed his laptop, looked around the apartment that smelled like the Korean restaurant downstairs and had water stains on the ceiling from the neighbor's overflowing bathtub last month. This was true zero, not performance or pretense. Just a man in a 400-square-foot apartment applying for a second chance at education he should have taken seriously the first time, hoping that enough honest work would eventually add up to something resembling a life he didn't have to be ashamed of. The weeks passed in rhythm with construction schedules. Garrett stopped checking his phone obsessively for scholarship updates. Focused instead on the daily work, coordinating inspections, reviewing submittals, making sure the crew had what they needed before they needed it. The building rose floor by floor. Interior walls went up. Electrical and plumbing rough-ins passed inspection. The project stayed on schedule, occasionally ahead of it, a minor miracle in an industry where delays were assumed and budgeted for. Garrett's supervisor at Bennett Global, a project manager named Patricia Chen, who worked from the downtown office and communicated primarily through terse emails, started copying him on correspondence with the architecture firm. Not asking his opinion, just keeping him informed. Small gesture, but it meant she trusted him not to leak information or screw up communication chains. One afternoon, Patricia actually visited the site, walked the building with Sandra, asked questions about material quality and timeline projections. Garrett stayed out of the way, reviewing delivery schedules in the trailer, but before leaving, Patricia knocked on the trailer door. "You're Ashford, the supervisor from the Riverside pitch." Garrett's stomach dropped. "Yes. Sandra speaks highly of your work, says you've been diligent about documentation and quality control. I'm trying to learn from people who actually know what they're doing." Patricia's expression was unreadable. Bennett Global doesn't typically hire people with your background for site supervision, but Ms. Bennett insisted we give you the opportunity if you proved competent. Sandra's recommendations suggest you have been. She left without explaining further. Garrett sat in the trailer trying to parse the message. Marlowe had arranged this job, not as charity, but as a test. Perform adequately, keep the position. Fail, and nobody would intervene on his behalf. It was the same structure as the scholarship opportunity, without guarantees, demanding proof through action rather than promises. The scholarship notification arrived on a Thursday, plain email with the Bennett Global logo signed by Victor Sterling. Your application for the Theodore Bennett Second Chance Initiative has been accepted. Program begins in August. Tuition fees and a modest living stipend will be provided for 2 years, contingent on maintaining satisfactory academic progress and adhering to the program's ethical standards. Attached were enrollment documents for the community college's construction management program. A syllabus showing classes in structural engineering, project management, sustainable building practices, construction law. The kind of education Garrett should have pursued instead of cutting corners with business degrees and networking events. Sandra found him in the trailer staring at the acceptance email. Good news or bad? Scholarship. I got in. The Theodore Bennett thing, you applied for that, seemed worth trying. Sandra leaned against the trailer wall. Marlowe Bennett put significant money behind that program. From what I hear, she's particular about who gets selected. Standards are high. I'm aware. You going to take it? The question surprised Garrett. Why wouldn't I? Some people can't accept help from someone they've wronged. Pride gets in the way. Garrett thought about the check for $10,000. About the site supervisor job he'd almost certainly only gotten because Marlowe had instructed Patricia to give him a chance. About the scholarship funded by money that should have been his if he'd been the kind of husband who recognized his wife's value before she had to prove it by leaving. Pride already cost me everything worth having. I'm not letting it cost me this too. Sandra nodded. Classes start in August. You'll need to finish out the summer here, make sure we're buttoned up before you transition. Think you can manage that? Yes. Then congratulations. Don't screw it up. The summer became a countdown. Garrett worked 12-hour days, determined to leave the Riverside project in perfect condition. Documented everything, obsessively change orders, inspection reports, subcontractor communications. Created a transition binder for whoever would replace him, detailed enough that someone with minimal experience could pick up where he left off. Deshawn noticed the extra effort. You gunning for a promotion. You're working like someone trying to prove something. Going back to school in August. Want to make sure I don't leave a mess behind. College at your age. Never too late to learn how to do things properly. Deshawn grinned. Good for you, man. Most people, they get knocked down, they stay down. You're getting back up. Trying to. That's all anyone can do. Try. Show up. Do better tomorrow than you did today. The final week of July. Garrett walked the completed Riverside building with Sandra. Every unit finished, appliances installed, final inspections passed. Families were scheduled to start moving in mid-August. The community gardens had been planted by volunteers, already showing green growth. Solar panels gleamed on the roof. The ground floor dedicated housing units were being prepared for the teachers and nurses and transit workers who'd won the lottery for below-market rate leases. This is good work. Sandra's voice held rare warmth. Building will last. People will have homes. That matters. Thank you for teaching me how to do it properly. I didn't teach you much, mostly just pointed out when you were about to make mistakes. You did the learning yourself. They stood in the lobby, sunlight streaming through windows that had been replaced after Deshawn caught the manufacturer's error. The building smelled like fresh paint and new carpet. Outside, landscapers were finishing the walkways, creating accessible paths between buildings. What are you going to do after you finish the program? Sandra's question was casual, but her eyes were sharp. I don't know yet. Learn as much as I can, try to build things that matter. Maybe work my way up to project management if anyone will hire me after you became the cautionary tale about intellectual property theft. Sandra's bluntness was jarring. You're going to carry that reputation for years, maybe permanently. Question is whether you let it define you or whether you build something on top of it that's heavier and more solid. How do I do that? Same way you've been doing it. Show up. Work honestly. Don't claim credit you haven't earned. Don't cut corners. Let your work speak for itself. Eventually the work becomes louder than the mistakes. Garrett wanted to believe that. Wanted to think that 2 years of education plus consistent ethical behavior would be enough to rebuild a career. But he'd seen how the industry worked. Reputations were currency. Once you were known as someone who'd stolen ideas and presented them as your own, most doors stayed closed. Sandra seemed to read his thoughts. It won't be easy. Some people won't give you a second chance, don't care how much you've learned or changed. But some will. Find those people. Work for them. Learn from them. Build a reputation, one project at a time. Is that what you did? Sandra smiled, rare and genuine. I came up in this industry when women weren't supposed to be on construction sites except to bring the men lunch. Had to prove myself every single day, every single project. Still do sometimes. But the buildings don't care about gender. They care whether the foundation is sound and the materials are quality, and the people building them give a damn about doing it right. Focus on that, the rest becomes manageable. She handed Garrett an envelope. Inside was a letter of recommendation printed on Sandra Oak's contracting letterhead. You might need that. For internships during the program or job applications after. It's honest, covers what you did here, how you learned what you're capable of when you check your ego at the door. Garrett's throat tightened. Thank you. Don't thank me. Thank me by not wasting the opportunity, by actually becoming the kind of professional I said you could be in that letter. I will. We'll see. Talk is cheap. Buildings are expensive. Show me with the work. She left him standing in the lobby. Garrett read the letter 3 times. Sandra's words were precise, specific, documenting his growth from someone who didn't know how to read a soil compaction report to someone who could coordinate multiple trades and catch quality issues before they became structural problems. The letter didn't mention his past. Didn't need to. It spoke only to the work he'd done, the competence he'd developed, the potential she saw if he continued learning with the same humility he'd shown on this project. Garrett folded the letter carefully, placed it in his wallet behind his driver's license and the community college enrollment confirmation he'd been carrying for 2 weeks. These were his credentials now. Not his old business degree or the networking contacts that had evaporated or the confident pitch skills that had masked incompetence. Just documentation of work done properly, recommendations from people who'd supervised him doing it, and the chance to learn what he should have learned a decade ago. The scholarship included a small living stipend. Garrett calculated carefully it would cover rent on a cheaper apartment closer to campus, basic groceries, bus fare. No extras, no safety margin. But it was enough, which was more than he'd had 4 months ago when Sandra first asked him if he actually knew anything about construction. August arrived. Garrett's last day at Riverside was a Friday. The crew threw a small gathering in the completed community room, pizza, sodas, a cake from the grocery store with "good luck" written in blue icing. Deshawn gave a short speech about how rare it was to work with a supervisor who admitted when he didn't know something instead of pretending. Sandra presented Garrett with a hard hat signed by everyone on the crew, inside of it a note. Don't forget where you learned this. Garrett had trouble speaking, managed to thank everyone for their patience, for teaching him what actual work looked like, for not giving up on him when he was clearly learning on the job. Patricia appeared surprising everyone. Handed Garrett an envelope. Inside was a check for $5,000. Performance bonus. Ms. Bennett authorized it for supervisors who bring projects in on schedule and under budget. You earned it. Garrett stared at the check. $5,000. Combined with the scholarship stipend, it meant breathing room. Meant he could focus on school without working night shifts to make rent. Meant Marlowe was still somehow creating space for him to rebuild even after everything he'd done. Please tell Ms. Bennett I'm grateful. Tell her yourself. Patricia pulled out a business card. She occasionally meets with scholarship recipients. You can email her assistant to request a meeting if you'd like. The card was heavy stock embossed. Marlowe Bennett, Chief Executive Officer, Bennett Global Holdings. Below it, an email address and phone number Garrett didn't recognize. He pocketed the card without committing to anything. That night in his apartment that would be empty by Monday, Garrett sat on the floor with his laptop and composed an email he deleted 7 times before settling on something that felt honest. Miss Bennett, Patricia Chen informed me that you authorized the performance bonus and personally selected me for the scholarship program. I don't know what to say beyond thank you, which feels inadequate. I'm aware that the opportunity I'm receiving is more than I deserve and more than I would have offered if our positions were reversed. I intend to honor it by learning properly this time, by building competence instead of performing it, by becoming someone who adds value instead of claiming credit. I don't expect forgiveness, but I hope eventually to prove that your faith in second chances wasn't misplaced. Garrett Ashford. He sent it before he could reconsider. Closed the laptop. Looked around the apartment he'd lived in for 5 months, the longest stretch he'd stayed anywhere since the divorce. The walls were still bare. The furniture was minimal. But it was the first place he'd lived where he wasn't pretending to be someone else, wasn't maintaining an image that required lying about his circumstances or his capabilities. Marlowe's response arrived 3 hours later. Short, professional, completely devoid of emotion. Mr. Ashford, the program exists for people willing to acknowledge their failures and work to correct them. Your acknowledgement is noted. Your work is what matters now. Best of luck in your studies. M.B. That was it. No warmth, no encouragement beyond the bare minimum, but also no cruelty, no lingering anger, just the clean transaction of someone who'd created a system designed to catch people capable of growth and let them prove it through action. Garrett saved the email. Not for comfort, but as a reminder. This was the relationship now former spouse who'd destroyed his career and then created an avenue for rebuilding, not out of love or even forgiveness, but out of a systematic belief that people could change if they wanted to badly enough and were willing to do the work without guarantees. It was more than he deserved. He intended to prove it wasn't more than he could become. 9 months into the construction management program, Garrett's GPA stood at 3.87. Not because he was brilliant, but because he'd learned to ask questions until he understood the answer completely, to work problems multiple times until the solutions became intuitive, to stay after class discussing structural load calculations with professors who appreciated students who cared about precision over grades. The program was harder than he'd anticipated. Not the coursework itself, though. Thermodynamics and materials science required more math than he'd used in years, but the discipline of admitting when he didn't understand something. Every instinct honed during his years of performance urged him to nod confidently, to fake comprehension, to maintain the appearance of competence. But he'd watched that strategy destroy his life once. He wasn't repeating the pattern. His classmates were younger mostly. Kids fresh from high school or workers in their 20s looking to move from labor to management. A few were older, a woman named Rita, who'd been a paralegal before deciding she wanted to build things instead of litigate about them, a former Marine named Jackson, who'd done construction in the service and wanted the credentials to go civilian. They studied together in the library, worked through problem sets, debated whether certain building codes were safety requirements or bureaucratic overreach. Nobody knew Garrett's history. He'd introduced himself as someone transitioning from real estate development to construction management, which was technically true if you omitted the catastrophic failure that necessitated the transition. Rita figured it out first. Caught him one evening in the library laptop open to an article about Bennett Global's expansion into affordable housing markets. "That's your ex-wife." Rita's voice was matter-of-fact, not accusatory. "Marlo Bennett. The article mentioned her scholarship program. You're one of the recipients." Garrett considered denying it. Decided honesty was less exhausting than maintaining lies. Yes, the story made the rounds a couple years back. Developer caught stealing his wife's ideas company she secretly owned, destroyed his career. "You're that guy. I'm that guy." Rita sat down across from him. "Must be strange taking money from someone you hurt that badly. It's educational. Every day I'm reminded that competence isn't something you perform. You either have it or you don't, and pretending won't sustain you when the performance ends." She studied him with the same analytical focus she brought to contract law homework. You could have disappeared, changed your name, moved to another state, started over where nobody knew, thought about it. But running from mistakes doesn't unmake them, just postpones the reckoning. Rita nodded. My ex-husband embezzled from the firm I worked for. Small amounts over 2 years, but it added up. When they caught him, I had the choice to pretend I didn't know or admit I'd suspected but said nothing because I didn't want to believe it. I admitted it. Lost my job. Lost my professional reputation. That's why I'm here starting over in a completely different field. Did he go to prison? 18 months. Gets out next year. We're divorced, but I still visit him sometimes. Not because I forgive him or want him back, because I want to understand how someone becomes the kind of person who steals from people who trust them. Figure if I understand that I'm less likely to become it myself. Garrett had never considered visiting Celeste or attempting to repair that bridge. She'd made her position clear through her attorneys. He'd cost her father $5 million and embarrassed her publicly. No reconciliation was possible or desired. But Marlowe was different. He hadn't just cost her money. He'd dismissed her contributions for years, claimed her ideas as his own, treated her value as negligible. Have you figured it out? The thing that makes someone become that? Rita closed her textbook. I think it's the gap between who you believe you are and who you actually are. When the gap gets too wide, you start lying to cover the distance. First to other people, then to yourself. Eventually, you can't tell the difference between what you've earned and what you've stolen because the story you're telling yourself requires both to be the same. That was the most accurate diagnosis of Garrett's failures he'd ever heard. The gap between the ambitious developer he'd believed himself to be and the junior associate who couldn't advance without shortcuts. Between the visionary husband who deserved a more sophisticated partner and the man who'd been too insecure to acknowledge his wife's intelligence. Between the professional who commanded respect and the fraud exposed in front of 47 witnesses. How do you close the gap? You don't. You build something new on honest ground and accept that the old version is dead. Mourning is fine. Nostalgia is fine. But resurrection is impossible. The person you were doesn't get to come back. You have to become someone else entirely. They worked in silence for the next hour. When Rita packed up to leave, she paused. For what it's worth, the work you're doing in structural analysis is solid. You're not performing competence anymore. You're actually developing it. Thank you. Don't thank me. Just keep doing it. The world has enough people faking expertise. We need more people willing to actually learn. The spring semester brought an internship requirement. Students were expected to work 20 hours weekly with a construction firm applying classroom learning to real projects. Most of Garrett's classmates had connections through family or previous jobs. Garrett had Sandra's letter of recommendation and a history that made most firms politely decline his application. The rejections accumulated. 12 firms, 12 versions of, "We've decided to pursue other candidates." Some were diplomatic, others were blunt. We did our due diligence. Your professional history raises concerns about ethical standards. We wish you the best in your future endeavors. Garrett kept applying. Expanded his search beyond Chicago to suburbs, then to neighboring counties. Found a small firm in Aurora that specialized in residential projects, owner-operated, less likely to have heard about the Bennett global scandal. Sent his application with Sandra's letter and a cover note explaining that he'd made serious professional mistakes, had spent the intervening time rebuilding his competence from scratch, and was seeking an opportunity to prove that people could learn from catastrophic failures. The owner, a man named Thomas Brennan, called 3 days later. I remember the articles about your situation. Dramatic stuff. You really stole your wife's ideas. Yes. I convinced myself I was collaborating, but I was taking credit for work I didn't do. When confronted with evidence, I couldn't deny it. Why should I hire you? Because I understand now what I didn't then, that shortcuts compound. One stolen idea becomes a pattern, becomes a career built on foundations that can't support scrutiny. I'm learning to build properly this time, the hard way, the permanent way. Thomas was quiet for several seconds. I run a small operation. 6 full-time guys. 2 office staff. We do good work for middle-class families who want additions, renovations. Nothing fancy, but everything built to last. Can't afford mistakes or drama. Can't afford someone who's still figuring out basic integrity. I understand. I appreciate you considering my application. Come in tomorrow. 2 o'clock. Let's talk face-to-face. The office was in a converted warehouse near the Fox River. Modest operation exactly as Thomas described. The conference room walls were covered with photos of completed projects, kitchen remodels, basement finishes, garage conversions. Quality work, nothing ostentatious. The kind of construction that improved lives without requiring mortgages families couldn't afford. Thomas was in his 50s, weathered face, calloused hands. Sat across from Garrett with Sandra's letter open on the table between them. Sandra Oakes doesn't give recommendations lightly. I've known her 20 years. If she says you learn to check your ego, I believe her, but learning on one project doesn't prove you've changed permanently. No, sir. It proves I'm capable of learning. Whether I've changed permanently is something only time can demonstrate. The internship pays $15 an hour. You'll work directly with me, assisting on estimates, coordinating with clients, managing subcontractors. Mistakes are learning opportunities as long as you're honest about them. Lies or credit claiming gets you fired immediately. Clear. Clear. You start Monday. Don't make me regret this. Garrett didn't. The work was unglamorous, measuring spaces for renovation quotes, reviewing material costs, calling suppliers to verify delivery schedules. Thomas supervised everything closely, not because he didn't trust Garrett, but because that's how he ran his business. Every estimate got double-checked. Every client conversation got documented. Every subcontractor agreement got reviewed for ambiguities that could cause disputes later. This is how you prevent problems. Thomas walked Garrett through a kitchen remodel estimate. See this line item, electrical upgrade. Could just say $1,500 and hope the client doesn't ask questions. But I break it down, new panel, new circuits, labor hours, permit fees. Client sees exactly what they're paying for. If something changes mid-project, we can point to the original estimate and show why the cost adjusted. What if breaking it down makes the total look more expensive? Then it's more expensive. Better the client knows up front than gets hit with surprises later. Trust is built on transparency. Lose trust, lose the client. Lose enough clients, lose the business. Garrett absorbed the philosophy, applied it to every interaction. When a client asked if they needed to replace plumbing in a basement renovation, Garrett didn't upsell. He explained that the existing pipes were functional but old, showed them photos of the corrosion, gave them prices for replacement versus maintenance, and let them decide. They chose replacement, but because they understood the reasoning, not because Garrett had pressured them. Thomas noticed. You're getting better at listening. First few weeks you wanted to solve problems before fully understanding them. Now you ask questions. Sandra taught me that. So did you. Turns out understanding the problem is harder than proposing solutions, but the solutions work better when they're based on reality. Most people never learn that. They go their whole careers proposing solutions to problems they haven't bothered to understand. I was that person. Past tense is important. Keep it that way. The semester ended with Garrett's GPA holding at 3.89. He'd expected satisfaction, top of his class internship going well, professors writing recommendations for future employment. Instead, he felt hollow. The grades were proof of competence, but they didn't erase the years he'd spent faking it. Didn't restore the relationships he'd destroyed through arrogance. Didn't make Marlowe's scholarship less necessary or his dependence on her generosity less humiliating. Rita found him after their final exam studying the grade posted outside the classroom. You look miserable for someone who just aced structural engineering. Acing an exam doesn't mean I've fixed anything that matters. What matters? Being the kind of person who doesn't need a scholarship funded by someone I betrayed. Being someone who earns opportunities instead of being given them as an act of charity or social experiment. Rita's expression hardened. You think Marlo Bennett is running a charity? The woman controls $1.3 billion in assets. She doesn't waste money on social experiments. She invested in you because she saw something worth developing. Question is whether you're going to honor that investment or keep wallowing in self-pity. I'm not wallowing. You're absolutely wallowing. You've spent 9 months proving you can learn, proving you can work honestly, proving you can develop actual competence. But you're still treating this program like penance instead of opportunity, still defining yourself by your failures instead of by the person you're becoming. What if the person I'm becoming isn't good enough to justify the investment? Then you fail and the program cuts you loose. That's how investments work. But you haven't failed. You're succeeding. The only thing stopping you from acknowledging that is your need to perform suffering because you think you don't deserve success. Garrett had no response. Rita was right. He'd been so focused on proving he understood his mistakes that he'd forgotten to notice when he stopped making them. The grades, the internship, Thomas's increasing trust, these were evidence of change. Real change, not performance. But accepting them as legitimate felt like letting himself off the hook for years of being someone who hurt people through carelessness and arrogance. How do you accept that you've changed without forgetting what you did? You don't forget. You integrate it. The person who stole ideas and the person earning honest grades are the same person at different points in development. Neither one is fake. You were actually that arrogant. You're actually learning now. Both are true. The question isn't whether you deserve forgiveness. Forgiveness isn't something you earn, it's something someone else decides to give. The question is whether you're building something worth the space you take up. What are you building? A life where my competence isn't debatable. Where if someone asks whether I know how to read structural plans or estimate renovation costs or coordinate subcontractors, the answer is yes, demonstrably, with proof that doesn't require anyone's faith or charity. That's enough. It has to be enough. Rita left him standing outside the classroom. Garrett read the grade posting again. Structural engineering. A. Materials science. A. Construction law. A-. Project management. A. These weren't charity grades, weren't given because professors felt sorry for him or because Marlowe had made donations to the program. They were earned through hours in the library, through asking questions, until concepts made sense, through working problems, until the solutions became obvious. This was competence. Actual, demonstrable, no performance required competence. Garrett took a photo of the grade posting, sent it to Sandra with a message, "Finished first year. Thank you for teaching me what work actually looks like." Her response came 30 minutes later. Grades are proof you can learn. Second year is proof you can apply it. Don't get comfortable. The summer between academic years, Garrett continued working for Thomas full-time. The internship converted to regular employment, 40 hours weekly at $18 an hour, enough to cover rent, food, bus fare, and start building a small emergency fund. Thomas gave him more responsibility, managing entire projects, dealing directly with clients, supervising subcontractors when Thomas was handling other jobs. One project involved converting a garage into an accessible apartment for a client's aging mother. The scope was complex new electrical service plumbing extension, HVAC upgrade, compliance with ADA requirements. Budget was tight. Client was a teacher working 2 summer jobs to afford the conversion because nursing homes cost more than she made annually. Garrett worked the estimate carefully, found ways to value engineer without cutting quality, using stock cabinets instead of custom vinyl flooring, instead of hardwood basic fixtures, instead of designer. Got the total under $30,000. Client cried when he presented the numbers. She'd gotten quotes from larger firms starting at $50,000. How are you doing this so cheaply? We're not cutting corners. We're just not adding unnecessary markup. Thomas runs a lean operation. We make our profit on labor and efficiency, not on maximizing material costs. When can you start? Permits will take 3 weeks. We can start mid-July, finish by September. The project became Garrett's dissertation in applied competence. He managed every detail, ordered materials, scheduled inspections, coordinated plumbing and electrical subs, handled the inevitable problems that arose when you opened walls and found surprises. The original electrical panel was undersized. Garrett worked with the electrician to design an upgrade that met code without requiring complete rewiring. Found $300 in the budget by catching a supplier error on the window order. Thomas visited the site weekly. Reviewed Garrett's documentation, checked work, quality, talked to the client. After the third visit, he pulled Garrett aside. "You're running this like you've been doing it for years. Client is happy. Subs respect you. Work is quality. Where'd you learn this? From you. From Sandra before that. From every mistake I made when I thought competence was about appearance instead of substance. Most people don't learn. They just get better at hiding their inadequacies. I tried that. It didn't work out well." Thomas almost smiled. "You're ready for something bigger. I've got a commercial project starting in October. Small office renovation, but it's a step up from residential. Interested in managing it?" "Absolutely. It's not a guarantee. You screw up the garage conversion, the offer disappears. But you've earned the opportunity to try." The garage conversion finished on schedule, under budget. Client sent a thank you note with photos of her mother settling into the space. Photos Garrett kept in his desk drawer alongside Sandra's letter of recommendation. These were his credentials now, not degrees or networking contacts, but evidence that he could take a complex problem, break it into manageable components, solve each piece properly, and deliver something that improved someone's life. Second year of the program started in September. Advanced courses, sustainable design, heavy construction, construction finance. The professors were industry veterans who'd built skyscrapers and hospitals and infrastructure projects that would last generations. They spoke about construction as craft, about the responsibility of creating spaces where people lived and worked and raised families. Professor Callahan, who taught sustainable design, spent the first class talking about legacy. Every building you work on will outlast you. Long after you're dead, people will inhabit the spaces you helped create. The question isn't whether you can build something that stands up to inspection. It's whether you can build something you'd be proud to have your grandchildren live in. Garrett thought about Riverside, about families moving into apartments designed around Marlowe's ideas for community-focused development, about children growing up in those units, playing in the community gardens, benefiting from below-market rents that let their parents afford other necessities. The building would stand for 50 years, maybe longer. Every tenant who found affordable housing there was living proof that ideas mattered, that design choices had consequences, that shortcuts compounded into failures while quality work compounded into legacy. He'd contributed almost nothing to that legacy. Marlowe had conceived it. Sandra and her crew had built it. Garrett had supervised one project phase, learned enough to recognize quality when he saw it. But he hadn't created anything worth remembering. Not yet. The commercial project Thomas offered was an office renovation for a nonprofit that provided legal services to low-income families. Their current space was cramped, outdated, inaccessible. They'd scraped together funding for a modest upgrade, new layout, better lighting, ADA compliance meeting rooms that could accommodate clients in wheelchairs. Budget was $75,000. Garrett's job was to maximize value within that constraint. He spent 2 weeks on the design, working with the nonprofit's director to understand their workflow, how attorneys used space where clients waited, what storage was essential. Drew up floor plans, got Thomas's feedback, revised them, revised again. The director, a woman named Margaret Chen, reviewed the third revision carefully. "This is exactly what we need. How'd you figure out the flow so well? I asked you to describe a typical day, mapped where people moved, what tasks happened, where which spaces created bottlenecks. Design should serve function, not the other way around. Most contractors just give us what they think we want. Most contractors are optimizing for their convenience, not yours. We're optimizing for how you'll actually use the space for the next 20 years. Margaret studied Garrett. "Thomas mentioned you're in a degree program, scholarship from Bennett Global." "Yes. I read about that situation when it happened. The developer who stole his wife's ideas." "That was you." Garrett had learned to answer this question without defensiveness. "Yes. I claimed credit for work I didn't do. My ex-wife owned the company I was pitching to. She exposed the theft publicly and offered me a chance to rebuild properly. I'm taking that chance. Takes courage to admit that. Takes more courage to lie and maintain the lie indefinitely. I tried that approach. It didn't end well." Margaret nodded. "We serve clients who've made serious mistakes. Criminal records, evictions, debt. Easy to write them off as lost causes. But we've seen people turn their lives around when given the opportunity and held to high standards. Sounds like Bennett Global operates on the same principle. The scholarship program is rigorous. If I fail academically or ethically, I'm out. No second chances for the second chance. Good. Accountability matters. So does opportunity. You've got both. Don't waste them. The renovation took 3 months. Garrett managed every aspect: demolition, framing, electrical finishes. Brought the project in $500 under budget by negotiating bulk pricing on LED fixtures and finding gently used furniture through a commercial liquidator. The nonprofit staff moved into the renovated space the week before Thanksgiving. Margaret sent photos of attorneys meeting with clients in accessible conference rooms of case files organized in new storage systems of natural light-filling workspaces that had been dim and cramped. Sent a note thanking Thomas and Garrett for understanding that nonprofit budgets required creativity, not compromise. Thomas posted the thank you note in the office. Used it as teaching moment for the crew. This is what we do. We solve problems for people who can't afford the fancy firms. We make their budgets work without cutting corners. We build things that last. That matters more than high-profile projects with unlimited budgets. Garrett photographed the note, added it to his growing collection of evidence that competence could be built project by project, decision by decision, choosing quality over shortcuts even when nobody was watching. Finals approached. Garrett studied with Rita and Jackson, working through complex scenarios: project failures, budget overruns, safety violations, how to handle each situation ethically when easier options existed. The exams were essay-based, requiring students to analyze case studies and propose solutions that balanced business realities with professional obligations. One question haunted Garrett. A major client offers a lucrative contract contingent on hiring their preferred subcontractor who has a history of code violations. Do you accept the contract and monitor the sub closely, or decline the contract and lose the revenue? Garrett wrote 3 pages analyzing the question. Concluded that accepting the contract normalized unethical behavior, that monitoring couldn't prevent all violations, that losing revenue hurt less than losing integrity. Ended with a line that felt true even as he wrote it. Sometimes the cost of doing business is walking away from business that costs too much. Professor Delacroix, who taught construction ethics, returned the exam with a note in the margin. This answer would have been different 2 years ago. Yes, Garrett wrote back. 2 years ago, I wouldn't have seen it as a dilemma. Would have taken the contract and convinced myself the monitoring was adequate. Delacroix's response. And that's why you're here. Learning to see the dilemma is the first step. Having the courage to choose correctly is the second. The program ended in May. Graduation was held in the college auditorium, modest ceremony, families attending. Garrett invited no one. His mother had passed during his first year of study. His father, remarried and living in Arizona, had sent a congratulations card but made no mention of attending. The friends from his previous life had evaporated with his career. Rita sat beside him during the ceremony. You should have invited someone. There's nobody to invite. Bullshit. You could have invited Sandra, Thomas, people who've invested in your success. They're busy. Don't need to waste a Saturday watching me walk across a stage. It's not about need. It's about acknowledgement, about letting people who helped you witness the result. Garrett hadn't considered that, had been so focused on not being a burden, not asking for anything beyond what was already given, that he'd forgotten accomplishments could be shared. The dean called names alphabetically. Garrett walked across the stage, accepted his diploma, shook hands with professors who'd pushed him harder than he'd been comfortable with. The degree was official: Associate of Applied Science in Construction Management, graduating with honors, eligible for immediate employment in the field. After the ceremony, Rita introduced Garrett to her family. Her ex-husband wasn't there, still incarcerated, but her parents and sister attended. They congratulated Garrett warmly, asked about his plans. He mentioned continuing with Thomas's firm building experience before pursuing a bachelor's degree. Rita's father, a retired engineer, studied Garrett carefully. Starting over is hard at any age. Harder when you're rebuilding from public failure. Takes character, or desperation. Character is what you do with the desperation. You could have stayed bitter or entitled. Could have blamed your ex-wife for humiliating you instead of acknowledging she was right to expose your theft. You chose differently. I chose survival. We all choose survival. The question is what we're willing to become to survive. You chose to become competent. That's not nothing. The conversation stayed with Garrett through the summer. He worked for Thomas managing increasingly complex projects. The commercial renovation led to another, then a third. Thomas raised his pay to $22 an hour with hints about partnership if Garrett stayed another 2 years and proved he could handle business development. In August, a letter arrived from Bennett Global. Not email, physical letter, heavy stock, embossed logo. Inside was a single page signed by Marlowe. Mr. Ashford, congratulations on completing the Theodore Bennett Second Chance Initiative with honors. Your academic performance and field evaluations suggest you've developed the competence you were previously performing. Bennett Global tracks all scholarship recipients for 5 years post-graduation. We're interested in your continued development. A position is available in our project management division if you're interested. Starting salary is $65,000 annually. You would report to Patricia Chen and work on mixed-income housing developments similar to Riverside. This is not charity. It's a job offer based on your demonstrated capabilities. Accept or decline based on whether the work interests you, not on any sense of obligation. The past is immaterial. Your competence is current. M.B. Garrett read the letter 4 times. $65,000 was more than he'd made even at Sterling and Finch. Working for Bennett Global meant working for Marlowe in the industry where his failures were public record, surrounded by people who knew exactly who he was and what he'd done. It also meant building the kind of housing projects that actually mattered. Projects designed around community needs instead of profit maximization. Projects that gave families like the teacher who'd hired him for the garage conversion a chance at stability. He called Thomas first, explained the offer. Thomas listened without interrupting. What do you want to do? I want to accept. But it feels like I'm using you as a stepping stone. That's what internships and early jobs are. Stepping stones. I hired you knowing you'd move on eventually. Question is whether you're ready for that level of responsibility. I don't know. I'm more competent than I was 2 years ago. But $65,000 in project management for a company managing billion-dollar portfolios. That's pressure I haven't faced. You faced pressure when you managed my commercial projects, faced it when you brought the garage conversion in under budget. You didn't crack, didn't cut corners, didn't panic when problems emerged. That's readiness. What if I fail? Then you fail. But you'll fail honestly, doing work that matters for a company that invests in affordable housing. Beats failing while chasing profit margins for investors who don't care about the families living in the buildings you construct. Garrett called the number listed on the letterhead. Reached Marlowe's assistant, who scheduled a meeting for the following week. Bennett Global offices downtown, same building where Garrett's career had imploded 2 years earlier. Walking into that lobby felt like visiting a crime scene. Garrett took the elevator to the 15th floor where Patricia Chen's division operated. The receptionist directed him to a conference room. Patricia arrived 5 minutes later carrying a tablet and a leather portfolio. Mr. Ashford, good to see you. Congratulations on graduation. Thank you, Ms. Chen. Patricia, we're colleagues if you accept the offer. First question, why do you want this job? Garrett had rehearsed multiple answers. Decided on truth. Because I want to build things that matter. Housing that families can afford. Developments designed around community needs. Projects where the legacy is measured in improved lives, not maximized returns. Second question, can you handle working for the company you tried to defraud? The bluntness was jarring. Garrett forced himself to maintain eye contact. I didn't try to defraud Bennett Global. I successfully defrauded it by claiming ideas I didn't develop as my own original work. You caught the fraud during due diligence. Whether I can handle working here depends on whether I can accept that my competence is being evaluated constantly and fairly, which is exactly what should happen. Patricia made notes on her tablet. Third question. Marlowe Bennett will be your ultimate supervisor. Can you work for your ex-wife? She's not my ex-wife in the context of Bennett Global. She's the CEO who identified my fraud, offered me a path to rebuild, and is now evaluating whether I've developed enough competence to be useful. If I can't separate personal history from professional reality, I'm not qualified for the job. Fair answer. The position starts in October. You'd work on the South Side expansion, 4 buildings, 600 units, similar model to Riverside. Community input is essential. We're not building luxury apartments with a few affordable units to satisfy tax credits. We're building mixed-income housing designed to serve teachers, nurses, service workers, artists, people who make cities function but can't afford market-rate rents. That's the work I want to do. Salary is $65,000 as stated. Performance reviews are quarterly. Bennett Global has zero tolerance for ethical violations. Claim credit you haven't earned, you're terminated immediately. Cut corners that compromise safety or quality, you're terminated. Lie to clients or supervisors, you're terminated. Clear, clear. Patricia stood. Offer is formal. You have 2 weeks to decide. If you accept, we'll need you to sign an extensive ethics agreement acknowledging your history and committing to enhanced scrutiny for the first 2 years. If that's unacceptable, decline the offer. It's acceptable. Then welcome to Bennett Global. Don't make us regret this. Garrett gave Thomas 4 weeks' notice, helped hire and train his replacement, a recent graduate from the same program, finished his ongoing projects. The last one was a kitchen renovation for an elderly couple who'd lived in their house for 40 years. Modest scope, modest budget, but Garrett treated it with the same care he'd given the nonprofit office. The husband watched Garrett install the final cabinet pulls. You're young to be this meticulous. Most contractors your age are rushing through jobs to get to the next one. I spent years rushing, cutting corners, performing competence instead of developing it. I'm done with that approach. What changed your mind? I lost everything because I prioritized appearance over substance. Had to rebuild from zero. Turns out zero is a good foundation if you build honestly. The couple insisted on paying an extra $500, called it a craftsmanship bonus. Garrett tried to refuse. They insisted harder. He accepted, donated it to the legal nonprofit where he'd done the renovation. Margaret Chen sent a thank you note. The money funded intake services for 3 new clients. October arrived. Garrett's first day at Bennett Global started with orientation, benefits policies, ethics training that was more extensive than any he'd encountered. The trainer, a lawyer named Morris, didn't mince words. Bennett Global's reputation depends on ethical operations. We've had one major scandal in our history, an executive who was caught accepting kickbacks from contractors. He was terminated, prosecuted, and served 18 months in federal prison. We have zero tolerance because in this industry, one ethical failure can destroy decades of trust. Someone asked whether the enhanced scrutiny for certain employees was legal. Morris's expression didn't change. Enhanced scrutiny applies to anyone hired after a serious ethical violation in their past. It's disclosed during the hiring process. If you signed the agreement, you consented to the scrutiny. It protects both the company and the employee by creating clear expectations and documentation. Garrett had signed the agreement. 2 years of quarterly ethics reviews, random audits of his project documentation, immediate supervisory notification if any concern arose about his conduct. It was fair, more than fair given that most companies wouldn't have hired him at all. Patricia assigned him to the South Side project the second week, introduced him to the team, architects, engineers, community liaisons who worked with neighborhood organizations to ensure the development met actual needs instead of developer assumptions. The project manager was a woman named Lauren Torres, 15 years in affordable housing reputation for delivering quality work on impossible budgets. You're Ashford, the guy from the Riverside pitch. Yes. Patricia says you've rebuilt your competence. I'll verify that independently. You work for me now, which means I evaluate you on current performance, not past failures. But past failures inform my scrutiny level. You'll get more questions, more review, more pushback than other associates. If that's a problem, request a different project. It's not a problem, it's appropriate. Lauren nodded. First task, review the community input from the last 6 months. Summarize the key themes. I need to know you can listen to what people are actually saying instead of hearing what you want to hear. Garrett spent 3 days reading transcripts from community meetings, surveys, focus groups. The requests were consistent housing that families could afford, spaces for children to play safely, proximity to public transit, architectural design that respected the neighborhood's character instead of imposing generic luxury aesthetics. He summarized the findings in a 10-page memo. Lauren read it carefully, made notes, called him into her office. "This is good analysis. You identified the core themes without editorializing. Most people add their own interpretations, tell me what they think the community wants instead of what the community actually said. I learned that mistake is expensive. Better to understand the problem correctly than solve the wrong problem efficiently. Apply that principle to everything you touch on this project. We're not building monuments to our vision. We're building homes for people who've been priced out of their own neighborhoods. Their needs matter more than our preferences." The work consumed Garrett's focus. Days spent coordinating with architects, reviewing material specifications, evaluating contractor bids. Evenings studying building codes, researching sustainable materials. Learning how successful affordable housing projects balanced cost constraints with quality. Weekends visiting similar developments in other cities, talking to residents, understanding what worked and what didn't. 3 months in, Lauren assigned him to present design options to the Community Advisory Board, 15 residents who'd been selected to represent neighborhood interests. Garrett prepared meticulously visual aids, cost breakdowns, pros and cons of each approach. Rehearsed the presentation until it felt natural. The meeting was contentious. One design option included rooftop gardens but reduced ground-level green space. Half the board loved it, half hated it. Arguments escalated. Garrett let them talk, took notes, asked clarifying questions. When the debate exhausted itself, he spoke carefully. "Sounds like the core disagreement is whether green space should be accessible to everyone, including people with mobility limitations, or whether rooftop gardens provide enough value to justify reducing ground-level access. Is that accurate?" The board members looked at each other, nodded. What if we modeled both options with actual cost and square footage numbers? Show exactly how much ground-level space we'd lose, exactly how much rooftop space we'd gain, exactly what the cost differential is. Then you can make an informed decision instead of arguing hypotheticals. It took another month to develop the detailed models. The board chose a hybrid reduced rooftop gardens, maintained ground-level green space, came in under budget by using native plants that required less maintenance. The solution satisfied nobody completely, which meant it was probably the right compromise. Lauren pulled Garrett aside after the decision was finalized. "You handled that well. Could have pushed your preferred option. Could have gotten frustrated when they couldn't agree. Instead, you gave them information and let them decide. They're the ones who will live there. I'm just facilitating the process." Most developers don't see it that way. They see community input as obstacle to overcome. You're treating it as essential data, because it is. I spent years assuming I knew better than the people I was supposedly serving. That arrogance cost me everything. I'm not repeating the pattern. The South Side project broke ground in March. Garrett attended the ceremony with the team. Local officials gave speeches. Community members asked questions. Children played on the vacant lot that would become apartments, gardens, common spaces designed around their needs. Marlo attended. First time Garrett had seen her in person since the conference room revelation. She stood at the edge of the crowd talking to community board members, listening more than speaking. Noticed Garrett watching and walked over. "Mr. Ashford, Patricia says your work on community engagement has been exemplary. The community made it easy by knowing exactly what they needed. I just helped translate those needs into design language." That's the skill. Translation. Most developers never learn it. An awkward silence stretched. Garrett searched for something to say that wasn't apology or explanation or the 1,000 things he'd rehearsed and discarded. Marlo spoke first. "The groundbreaking is a beginning, not an end point. The hard work is maintaining quality and community focus through 2 years of construction. Budgets will get tight. Contractors will propose shortcuts. Officials will pressure for compromises that serve political goals instead of resident needs. Whether this project succeeds depends on whether the team keeps its commitments when nobody's watching." "I understand. Do you?" Because the Garrett Ashford I was married to would have made those commitments publicly, and violated them privately the moment it became convenient. The question isn't whether you understand the standard, it's whether you've become someone who maintains it when maintaining it costs you. Garrett met her eyes. The honest answer is, I don't know yet. I've been rebuilding for 2 years in contexts where failure hurts me most. I haven't faced serious temptation to cut corners because I can't afford the consequences. Whether I'd maintain standards when the stakes are someone else's housing instead of my own career that's still untested. Marlowe's expression shifted slightly. Might have been respect. That's the first genuinely honest thing you've said to me in years. Most people would have promised they've changed completely, that I can trust them absolutely. You're admitting you don't trust yourself yet. Should I trust is earned through repeated proof under varied circumstances. You've proven you can learn. Proven you can work honestly when supervised. Haven't yet proven you can maintain standards when unsupervised and under pressure. That's what the next 2 years will test. She walked away to rejoin the community board members. Garrett stood at the edge of the future construction site watching children play, imagining the buildings that would rise here. Buildings that would house families. Buildings that would last generations. Buildings that would be his legacy or his second catastrophic failure, depending entirely on whether he'd actually changed or just learned to perform change convincingly. The question wouldn't be answered today, wouldn't be answered in quarterly reviews or performance evaluations, would be answered in the thousands of small decisions accumulating over months and years, which contractors to hire, which corners not to cut, which promises to keep when keeping them was expensive and breaking them would go unnoticed. Garrett had spent 2 years learning that competence wasn't performance. Now he faced the harder test, proving that integrity wasn't performance either. That the person he'd become wasn't a carefully maintained facade, but a genuine transformation built on the ruins of who he'd been. The groundbreaking ceremony ended. The crowd dispersed. Garrett stayed looking at the empty lot that would soon be filled with construction noise and materials and the daily work of turning vision into reality. Somewhere in this city, Marlowe was probably returning to her office, reviewing other projects, making decisions that affected thousands of lives. She'd given him this opportunity not because she forgave him, but because her grandfather's philosophy said people could change if they wanted to badly enough. Garrett wanted to. Whether want was enough remained to be seen. But for now, standing on ground that would soon hold buildings designed around ideas Marlowe had conceived over spaghetti dinners years ago, he felt something that might have been hope, not confidence, not certainty, just the fragile possibility that becoming someone worthy of second chances was actually achievable, one honest decision at a time.